I want to thank everybody for joining us for this panel on industrialized construction. We've got a great group up here today. I'll introduce them in just a second, but by way of introduction, my name is Kyle Berry. I'm the Director for Project Management Operations here at NIBS. And again, thanks for joining us for this panel. Just to talk about a little bit about NIBS' experience with industrialized construction. We've really seen ourselves as sort of a locus for offsite construction, education, outreach, and research. So this includes our Offsite Construction Council, which was founded in 2013, as well as multiple projects working with the federal government to advance the market for offsite construction. So two quick projects I want to highlight that came out recently with our partners with ModX. We worked on an offsite for construction research roadmap, so specifically around housing, which was a consensus-based document that was focused on 6 areas of research that we felt that HUD could really overcome 6 critical barriers, which includes the regulatory framework, standards and systems performance, capital finance and insurance, project delivery and contracts, labor and workforce, and business models and economic performance, which I'm sure some of which we'll touch on today. Additionally, this past March, NIBS and ModX with HUD released the past, present, and future of HUD's role in accelerating offsite construction in the U.S. I think of interest to this group is the report's central finding, really that the barriers to industrialized construction aren't necessarily based around technology. This is technology that's been around a long time, and really true barriers are truly institutional. And so I think we've heard some talk over the past couple of days about. I think everyone has a firm understanding of the barriers, even going back not just at this conference, but also going back as far back as 1968 with HUD's Operation Breakthrough. So a little bit about what we're going to talk today. I think we find the AEC industry at a genuine inflection point. We're facing persistent labor shortages. There's a deepening affordability crisis. There's growing demands for resilience and disaster recovery, along with business models that really need to be oriented towards the future. So I think the convergence we're seeing now, especially around offsite construction, really can be seen as genuinely different. We have maturing digital tools, real capital flowing in from outside the industry, new and different product manufacturers entering the space, and a policy environment that's really starting to pay very close attention to these methods. So the goal today, and I'm really looking to serve as a goalie, given we're hockey season, a goalie throwing outlet passes to the geniuses we have up here, is really just to have an honest conversation about where we are. What's working, what isn't, where's the industry tried and stumbled, and where we think it's heading, and how firms across the AEC industry will need to prepare. So we're going to move through 3 areas: the current state of the industry, the practitioner perspectives from our panels up here, paired with frankly hard truths about adoption, and then an in-depth look about where things may be headed. So I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves in a minute, but just so that I can provide some level of introduction that seems polite. We have Josh Lobel, who's the business development executive at Autodesk with over 25 years experience in the industry. John Fay, CEO and founder of Lottabuild, a building tech company manufacturing what he calls the 2x4 of the future. And Alex Haldeman, who's the R&D manager at James Hardy Building Products, overseeing building codes and compliance for North America. So if we have time at the end, we'll save some time for Q&A, but I know these guys have an awful lot to talk about, so we're gonna dive in. So, but first things first, Josh, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Nice to meet everyone. I've been at Autodesk for 6 years now. Prior to that, I was 20 years in industry, so started in A, spent a little time in E, spent a lot of time in C, and most of that it had a lot of aspects of industrialized construction to it, even though we didn't call it that at the time. I wasn't really thinking about it that way. But it was constantly looking specifically at ways to better leverage digital technology to improve project delivery through figuring out where there are opportunities for repeatability, automation, ways of actually industrializing different parts of the process to get more done with less.
Alex?
Alex Haldeman, James Hardy Building Products. I've been with James Hardy for about 3 years now, specializing in codes compliance, but with a personal passion towards resilience and resilient design and materials. Prior to Hardy, I've been in and around the industry for many years, emphasis on modular and industrialized construction, most notably Katera. Not my fault what happened there. And in those roles was focusing on product development and identifying both components and full systems that would work in a modular environment.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So this is my second IBS event. I had the pleasure of going to the Anaheim conference, which was a great experience. So it's grateful to be here. So yes, I own a company called Lotta Build, formerly Lotta Cube. We changed it because everyone thought we made cubicles. So yeah, so I really come from an unconventional approach or background, I should say, to construction. Actually came from I'm an outsider, I would say, but really started Lotta Build in 2013, really with the idea of understanding how we can create new efficiencies in construction, looking at sustainability. And so what we do is we manufacture a panelized wall system that we do affectionately call the 2x4 of the future, and really understanding how we can build structures and tenant improvements, houses, all sorts of applications more efficiently, and then looking at really from the standpoint of productization construction. And so when we started, Lotta Build, the landscape looked much different than it does today, and so it's been really exciting to see industrialized construction really start to mature. Some wins and some losses, which I think they're all relevant. So thank you for your work, Alex. But yeah, so really understanding, how we look at design, software build to physical build. And so we really see it as a digital to digital application, looking at digital products that can be utilized efficiently and reutilize over time. So we call ourselves, basically a wall that looks like a real wall but can come apart. And so that's kind of what we manufacture and deliver.
Thanks, John. So just to dive into some of the questions for our panel today, I guess I'll point to you first, Josh. Plain language gives the state of play today. Where do we sit with industrialized construction within the market? How does it differ meaningfully from traditional methods? Talk a little bit about your understanding of the state of play.
Yeah, I think it's been really encouraging to listen to the different panels here. I think it seems like there's a lot of consensus around what the major topics are, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are. As far as the state of the industry goes, I think it's pretty much where it has been for quite a while. I don't think that's a bad thing, I don't think it's a good thing, but I feel like it's probably been for the last coming up on 10 years now that the expectation seems to have been in the next 3 to 5 years, there's expected to be a big change and move towards more industrialization. We haven't seen it yet. And I think a lot of those reasons of why that hasn't happened have been discussed on some of the various panels. A lot of stuff related to policy, pipeline, procurement. So in that regard, I think the industry is maturing. I think that's a really good word for it. But I think, now that I think about it, similar to my teenage daughters, maturing very slowly.
Thanks. John or Alex, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I have some stuff. So, a lot of you have probably seen the charts where you look at, the Industrial Revolution, you look at the technological revolution, you look at kind of the outputs on these categories and where they've created efficiencies or where they haven't. And you'll see traditionally that most industries on those charts have achieved about a 90% efficiency rating in terms of their improvements to production, to scaling, and then bringing costs down, right? So we can look at healthcare, electronics, automotive. And ironically, construction is one of these industries that sits at the bottom, and it's got about a 10% growth rate of technological revolution in terms of where the industry's gone, how it's improved. And so I think in some ways that's really depressing, and we see it in just the economy, and accessibility to affordable construction solutions. But I think also, the struggle is that in that there's so much opportunity. And so I just listened to all the speakers over the last 2 days. It's really exciting to get all of these brilliant minds in the room and start to see these conversations happening of where could we take industrialized construction, where can we create those improvements to make it an industry that really has much better outcomes. So,
thanks. Alex, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not really. Just that I'm noticing that it's still a fragmented market where with a lot of new innovations in materials is a good example. There'll be company A does a good job on one thing, company B does a good job on something different. And from a consumer perspective, that disparity between choices can cause confusion or hesitation. So one potential roadblock that I haven't heard yet is the fragmentation of industrialized construction.
Thank you. So, John, looking at you, I touched on a few of the barriers from the HUD report that NIPS produced. We talked a lot in our sort of panel planning sessions about the fact that there is no silver bullet. But just to think a little bit about some of the levers we can pull around some of the barriers, what are the ones that you see really as sort of the true ones that we can push that might have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think one of the topics for me that was spoken of yesterday was really around the amount of capital that's put into industrialized construction and that ecosystem. It far underpaces of these other categories, which is I think is why you see so much revolution and change happening in these other industries versus construction. And so I think that's one of the categories. I think another category, really has to do with code compliance. But I think honestly the biggest category, which is what Alex said, I think is the fragmentation and the lack of standardization. Right. So when you look at the history of building materials as an example, and you look at balloon framing and now it's stick framing that we have now, that was a massive improvement at the time and really created a lot more affordability, a lot more accessibility, and really a foundational standard of how we build. And I think that process of those systems, in my opinion, has kind of come to a place of being outdated, based on the workforce needs, based on how we need products to be utilized and reused. So I think it's just this underarching, theme of it's just time to upgrade the systems and the processes of how we build and come up with new standards.
Josh, I'll kick that question over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what John's saying. I agree with what a lot of the other panelists have said. I think in events like this, what can be really helpful is to also just try to, if we're all kind of agreeing on terminology and agreeing with the problems, is really try to dig down into the specifics of what those things mean in terms of what they can tell us about, maybe why we're stuck in certain places and what the right questions are that we need to answer. Because I think if we chase after answering the easy questions, or what seem to be the right questions, we can basically spend a lot of time, resources, money, and that, in the last 40, 50 years of trying to industrialize construction is kind of littered with that. Again, not necessarily a bad thing. But fragmentation, I think that's a great point. What do we mean by fragmentation? What does fragmentation look like in AEC? And, folks may be aware of this, but if you look at the National Labor Relations, if you look at the categorization of construction companies in the US and in EMEA, they're incredibly small. So the overwhelming majority in the US are 50 people or less. And the number of construction companies, 10 people or less, is a significant percentage. In the European Union, it's even higher. It's something like 80+% of what are categorized as construction companies are 10 people or fewer. So I think that's really helpful when we talk about fragmentation, because you can think about, okay, what are the pressures on a 10 or less person company that's working in an industry that has very tight margins and doesn't have a lot of demand aggregation. And I think it's pretty safe to assume, well, they're not going to do a whole lot of technology spend, they're not going to do a lot of R&D, they're not going to do a lot of innovation, because there's absolutely no reason to do it. They have no pipeline. They have nothing in the market that says, if you make these investments in working better and working differently, there is a way that you can even figure out an ROI on that. So, an easy comparison often, and again, this is stuff that's probably been out there a lot, is you look at the automotive industry, and the top 10 automotive manufacturers control about 90% of that market. So any one of them makes a shift in any direction, and the entire supply chain will follow them, because these are also things that get big upfront investment, and then they produce and produce and produce. You look at AEC, at least within the last 5 years, you take the top 10 construction companies globally, and you can include China in that, and you're talking about maybe 3% of the market. in terms of $13 trillion market and what's their annual turnover. So you can take the top 100 construction companies, say they all get in line behind industrialization, and the market won't move because there's just no influence there, not in that way. So from that respect, I think it is important in these conversations to say, what do we really mean by fragmentation? Because it helps us understand, okay, this is the current situation. It doesn't mean it won't work. It just means we have to approach the problem a little bit differently. We can't say, well, let's just do manufacturing but for construction. That won't work, not in the current market makeup. And again, to expect that a $13 trillion industry made up mostly of 10 people or less companies is going to pivot in 3 to 5 years to radically different ways of working, different business models? Probably not.
Well, you brought up a point on demand aggregation I want to stay with for a little bit, because I think one of the things we talked about was, there's been a lot of discussion about demand aggregation at a high level, but from a practitioner perspective, I'd love to hear from each of you about what demand aggregation means in practice, and then how it can help benefit the industry. So, Alex, I think I'll start with you.
Well, I want to do a quick follow-up with
please.
Josh here. Part of what you were discussing, I absolutely agree with, is you have a lot of these small builders, 10 or less, and it's a tight margin business. And the hesitation to change is because they care about putting food on their table, they care about their employees. And with the situation that we're in, that risk reward is a big risk, big reward. And if you're worried about, okay, can I pay my employees next week? You're not going to take that risk. And there might be ways to incentivize that risk taking, but it's not quite happening. And I'm sorry, you were asking something else.
That's all right, that's okay. Now, like I said, please feel free to jump in. Don't wait for my questions. Demand aggregation, we touched on. I think I'm interested in hearing more from a practitioner perspective from each of your different sort of sectors of this industry, what that means.
Well, with my experience with other companies in the past in modular, they tried to productize, didn't quite work, no one wanted to adopt, so they ended up becoming their own developers. And that was a way that they forced their supply chain. Not a lot of companies can do that though. And I don't want to call them winning technologies, but some of the newer technologies that are out there may not have that capital to be able to build their own. A single model home maybe, but not full developments. And I think partnership between developers of any size with industrialized construction would be good. And I know that there's a couple of big builders that are deeply investing in industrialized construction methodologies. It's a small price to pay for them for a huge win if it works. I know Lennar is one that I used to work for a company called Vive, which Lennar ended up buying. Personally, I don't think Lennar is going to switch 100% to off-site industrialized construction, but it is a little R&D hotbed of how can we apply these innovations to the broader spectrum. And it might be a baby step to build that supply chain and the resource out there for demand, maybe.
Makes sense. Joe, question to you?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges in industrialized construction is you build these big factories and there's so much invested, and now you have to feed the beast, right? And I think you see a lot of volumetric factories that have had challenges with that because it just needs this continual flow. And so so I kind of like what Alex said about incremental changes, things that can be implemented over time that maybe can create better efficiencies in those models. I think another issue sometimes is IP. So when you think about the accessibility for the foundations of how we build structure now, right? They're pretty open source in some ways from the standards. And I think industrialized construction, there's a lot of silos right now. And it's just like, how do we get those silos to open up and to really share information? And I think the sharing of that information will really start to move the industry forward as well.
Josh.
So I think on the earlier panel this morning, it was interesting that a distinction that was made that made me think a little bit about between like demand aggregation and demand certainty, which I hadn't really thought about that before. because I think they do slightly different things, at least from my perspective. So demand aggregation suggests then there is, some kind of centralized owner or authority that is basically generating that demand and kind of funneling it out there. So that can create some really promising opportunities from a technology provider standpoint, because it suggests that's also going to come with more standardized ways of working. And so if there are going to be more standard kind of data requirements for all the submissions and the ways of working across a horizontal supply chain, that's going to start bringing the supply chain together to look at more standard ways of working. And that can have very positive ripple effects on moving away, moving more towards what might, you can maybe call the commoditization of data workflows. Because then, you don't have to worry that, people are going to say, well, I want to work on this project, but I work this way, and they're asking for data this way, and then I want to work on this other project, and they need something totally different. Which is a lot of what we see today. I mean, we definitely see that different owners ask for different data in different ways, and it makes it really hard for their shared supply chains to actually come up with more effective ways of working that actually improve their tech investment and really leverage technology, especially on the software and digital side a lot more. So in that respect, there's, I think, a lot of potential promise in demand aggregation. Demand certainty is also very interesting, but that doesn't suggest that same kind of push towards standard ways of working based on this centralized owner or buyer.
Well, it actually reminds me about a story that I think I'm allowed to tell. At Katera, one of the issues we had in product development was the goal was the whole thing, all in one, full structure, and everything in it was owned by Katera. But what they found pretty quickly was there would be significant interest in a particular electrical wall panel assembly, but not in the wall itself. And so, in the product development side, we had to say, okay, it was initially designed to exactly plug into the Katera wall. But what the design team had to do is quickly shift and say, okay, well, if we extend this cord and change this to this location instead of there, now it can plug and play into anyone's wall system, not just Katera's. And that flexibility in design was critical in realizing if I can't win 100%, it's worthwhile to win the 30% I can. And being flexible in that respect was something I know that we did on the development side to, even with dishwashers that we designed. Initially, it was designed to have a 2-foot cord to save on money, but they accidentally put the plug on the wrong side and it didn't fit. So that flexibility in design, I think, is going to be crucial, whether it's digital or physical, to make sure that it can plug and play with different features, as opposed to trying to focus on the all or nothing, which some companies in the past, at least, were trying to focus on.
So I want to stay on this topic of sort of repeated mistakes. Because I think, as I mentioned, this technology is not new. It's been around for a long time. There's probably been various waves in which there's been excitement about it, et cetera. And Alex, after you're done sipping your water, I'm going to come back to you again. What went wrong? What were the repeated mistakes that happened? You've touched on a couple of things so far. I think everybody has. Let's sort of bracket them for the purposes of this question.
Well, on the product development side, we did nothing wrong whatsoever. No, there's a lot of big ambitions, and the leadership and even the design teams were very focused on, okay, let's win everything, let's go big. And the goal was ambitious, and everyone thought it was possible. But one thing that didn't work was the realization, and it was too late, at least in my opinion, for the realization to go, let's pull this back, yes, let's work towards winning it all, but there has to be incremental steps. You mentioned the silver bullet. There's no one panacea, no one solution to fix everything. One thing that in the past, at least, I would regularly hear from companies I work for and others was, we are now the solution to everything. And that's just not the case. So I think I'm not hearing it nowadays, but definitely that's something we don't want to repeat, is trying to misinform people that this will solve all your world's problems.
I'm going to hesitate following up on my next question, which was for John. I'm going to go to you on this question to see if you have any insight on the repeatability.
Yeah, I mean, I think I call them learning, right? Opportunities is what we call them at Lauderdale. And I think it's a necessity of the industry, and it helps us get to where we're going. right? I think with what Alex said, I think about, it won't be one player. So anytime I think you come across the conversation with a company or visionary where they say they're going to own everything, it's like, that's not going to happen. It's just impossible. It's such a giant fragmented industry. And so I like the idea of really creating, once again, those standards, kind of the playground that we should play in, and how other companies can then create within that playground and have their their products, be introduced into those environments and really create those incremental efficiencies that then add up to just a broader, greater efficiency of how we can, reduce our costs of construction, our speed, our sustainability, reusability, kind of all those buzzwords.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I want to jump in on it because it made me think about a couple of things. I agree. I think the most important thing in my mind right now is lessons learned. As an industry, we seem to be really bad about this, and we seem to have an extremely short memory. And I think context is key. So two things I want to touch on. One, and I think this is probably maybe a little bit of an over-indexed crowd on the topic of Operation Breakthrough, but I consider myself kind of a student of the history of industrialization. It's why I spend a lot of time trying to study the history and understand what's gone before, because it's 40, 50, 60 years of making these attempts. There's got to be a lot to learn there, rather than just saying, oh, well, I know why it didn't work before because we didn't have AI yet, or we didn't have whatever. And that's just not the case. I mean, I only learned about Operation Breakthrough a few years ago. And if you were to talk about, ask anyone today, okay, if you were going to design a way to try to industrialize housing in the US, how would you do it? You would do Operation Breakthrough. Not even talking about what were the factors that led to it not working here, but being adopted in Japan and Sweden and working fantastically. But just that already got lost within a few decades. It got completely lost. It's not regularly talked about when we talk about efforts of industrialization. So I think that is a big problem. And another example, and I didn't realize you worked with Beeb, so I heard a story about Beeb, and I'm going to tell it. I hope you don't mind. And I hope this wasn't your fault. But I saw a presentation by, earlier this year, a guy from Beeb, and he talked about how, similar kind of thing, so it was, designing, building the whole system, and all of the different parts that needed to be procured from different vendors in order to make it work. And for the bathroom, it was the shower pan. Everything was designed basically around this shower pan. And then the shower pan manufacturer stopped making it. And this is another really interesting thing, I think, that I hadn't thought about because I come from AEC. In manufacturing, there are there's specific and accepted ways of when you end of life, if you're a vendor or a product provider, how you end of life products, giving advance notice, giving companies plenty of time to understand you are no longer making a part so they can switch over. That doesn't happen in AEC. So Vive was left stuck with this huge problem of now having to figure out how to spend all this money redesigning because they couldn't procure that shower pan anymore. But the interesting part of this story is that exact same thing happened 50 years ago to Lustron Homes. And if anyone remembers Lustron Homes, they were, again, a complete housing package made of, I think, a lot of ceramic and other stuff. And there was an article that they went, a shower pan. The shower pan for Lustron Homes became unavailable and led to all kinds of supply chain issues for them. And it was just that is amazing. And honestly, WTF, what are we doing? Lessons learned. I just want to come back to that.
Well, so from this, I take away two things. One, don't use shower pans. But then also, I think it triggers me when I think of the digital twin. And a lot of the companies I've worked with and for focus on digital twin, and the beautiful thing about it is you have a full, complete design, which is kind of required for industrialized. But the other side of the double-edged sword is, while it's great for that, it also puts you into a situation where everything is so perfect that you lose that gray area of flexibility. So when you do lose a particular part, it no longer functions because now it's a critical component of this 100% design, as opposed to something where it's oh, well, the contractor will figure it out. So it reminds me of digital twin and the pros and cons of that aspect of design.
So taking a quick step back, I want to talk about data and how data leads to a successful project, how we capture data that, for example, can lead to lessons learned and how those are captured. So Josh, over to you. How do we build the data culture that the industry needs?
Well, I think you said that really well. It is a culture thing. It's not a technology thing. It's not a software thing. It's a culture thing. It is how tools are used, how they're employed, how requirements are written, how they're shared, how checking is done. So it's a big change management issue. A slide that Autodesk puts up a lot, and to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of because it reads a little too simply, is that 95% of data throughout a typical design and construction project goes unused. And I don't love it because the implication is like, oh, well, I guess you only need 5% of data then to do a project. Like, what the hell are we wasting the time with? But I think more what it speaks to is that this idea that you need 100% of the data generated throughout a project, like, that's false. That's just not needed. Most data that's generated is probably only necessary for the individual companies and how they run their business. But that's kind of the problem is, I think getting to the point of understanding what data is actually needed by whom and when, so that requirements can be written, automation can be built around requirements checking throughout the process. So like, when people say they want to break down silos, again, I get a little bit nitpicky when it comes to these metaphors. Breaking down silos is a terrible idea. All you do is end up with a big mess of grain all over the ground. You can't do anything. You got to connect silos. Silos exist for really good reasons. They have to be connected. That's a much more important thing. But not everything needs to be connected. So understanding those connections, how you build them, and again, how that can kind of drive repeatability. So I think, again, it kind of comes back to this idea that if every project you even have to work a little bit differently digitally with how you interface with your other contractual partners, it's a disincentive to try to figure out how to make some of this stuff work better. We don't have the legal framework to drive more data consistency because data is not a contractual deliverable. And so there's all these problems. And so I come back again, I think it's really around a more of a culture thing, is the business model incentives don't exist to really fix a lot of these problems, even though they're a big headache for a lot of people, because we'd like to work differently, but again, you've got all these different parts and pieces that kind of need to all change simultaneously in complementary ways for there to be real value there.
Well, I'll say, we look at it more of the product side, which is, for us, is great because it's more of a one-to-one application. And so we had this really great partnership with Autodesk and a company out of the UK called Cope, 2024, 2025. And really, we came to them with a problem saying, hey, we have this digital building system that does not speak to the software side of drawings, Revit or all these other platforms. And just really having this vision for computational design of because what was happening is a customer would send us a file, we take that file and we have to, what I would affectionately call, modify it. So we basically take that file and overlay it with our product. And so in that process, we would spend on a typical larger project 200 man hours doing that, which we found through kind of doing the math, equated about $12,000 a project just on the design side. And so Autodesk, the Informed Design team, which is a really cool new division of Autodesk, came to us and said, hey, we think we can help you. And so we basically started on this project and got a 200 man-hour design a project down to around 3 seconds. And so you could literally compute out the entire floor plans in a matter of seconds, and then it gave really great empirical data on the compatibility of our set product, which is 7 sizes of wall cassettes, and how with just 7 sizes of cassettes, how many floor plans you could throw at it and what it could achieve. And I'm really excited to say, it consistently was at 93 to 97% compatibility. So when you think of standardization, efficiencies of productization, and then how that flowed into a project, and then really for us too, it's those data sets that eventually will lead to, being able to build in real time with aggregated costs attached to products. Just like if you were to go buy an iPhone in Colorado where I live, or here in DC, You're going to pay the same price, you have transparency, but similar type information can be flowed through on those data points that flow into costings, manufacturing shop orders, and then deliverables for installation. So I love the practical application of data, and I know it goes much deeper in other categories, which may not be as useful, but for us from a product standpoint, it's been outstanding.
Honestly, I wish that was around 10 years ago. It was a big problem that I faced at multiple companies, even recently with James Hardy. So there's a demand or desire for the custom lengths, custom sizes of products, as opposed to a shift in design to design for commodity sizes. The concept of a software that can plug and play your pre-designed product shapes and sizes into a custom architectural plan is fantastic. One of the companies I worked for, we intentionally created wall panels that were generic enough we could just plug and play into different designs, but it took a lot of creativity to honestly me with pieces of paper cut out on a table going, okay, oh, that doesn't work, all right, let me try this one. And it was a very manual process to try and make it work for a product as opposed to the customized nature that people really wanted, and architects definitely wanted.
Yeah, I think the fun thing too is like you think you might lose out on customization, and you do at some level, but what you find is some of the customization you don't really need as much, right? So it's like how many times has an architect drawn a 10-foot section of wall over and over and over again on a drawing or project, right? And we productize that, right? We say that's 2 4-foot cassettes and a 2-foot cassette, and so removing some of that allows the architects and the creatives to really focus more, I think, on other aspects of projects and construction.
Anybody last word?
Yeah, no, I think these are great points. It is probably something really worth very specifically naming is that designing for constructability and buildability is extremely important, and I think that is a foundational aspect towards industrialization. And they are two separate things. Constructability is not can it be built; it's can it be built for the cost and schedule and that you are working with. And so that is how you evaluate constructability of a design. Not can it actually be built and budget and schedule be damned, that's how most projects work. Buildability then means, and can it be done where you're building? Does it meet the code requirements? And if that is not baked into design from the very beginning, we have what we have right now, which are lots of problems, lots of scope creep, lots of delays that happen when you have to take a conceptual design and then turn it into a built thing, as opposed to what we're talking about, which is you're only ever designing something that is known buildable from the start. And that is a huge push that we're certainly making in terms of how to create the ability for people to do that without radically changing current ways of working. And so it's really, it's moving from an idea of engineer to order to configure to order. And that is how I think we get a lot closer to this idea of industrialization, the way that the manufacturing industry works.
And so let's pick up on that thread a little bit, because something we talked about in prepping for this panel is the idea of, the movie title we talked about, industrialization, services to products. So, John, I'm going to start with you. Just take it and run.
Yeah, services product. Yeah, I kind of mentioned a few applications for that, but it's really the way that our life works in general. When we go buy products, we have clear expectations on costs, on deliverables, and so I just feel like, construction in general has been so fragmented, like we talked about it. The standards have been so kind of loose over the last few years, especially, and it's been compounded by increasing costs of materials, lots of unknown factors on projects, overruns, delays, right? And so I just feel like, productization is such an exciting category because it really fits into everything else that we do as humans and from a category of products. And I feel like it's the new frontier of possibilities, and I think it's going to benefit everyone. I think the costs are going to come down over time. That's what I'm seeing. which is unheard of in construction, relatively speaking. I think costs have gone up 20% year over year since COVID. And then also, just understanding, I think long term, the circularity of products. So the ability to basically deconstruct these products, and that's kind of what our system does. You can take the walls apart, you can reconfigure them, relocate them, or resell them. So being able to keep these products, kind of continually being used in these ecosystems, it creates tremendous savings. I'll just share one quick project. So we do a lot of projects for Walmart, and so for 4 years in a row, we built out all their new vision and optometry centers. And so, kind of under the hood, I don't know if I'm supposed to share this. But the cost typically for that build out was around $260K. It would take over a month to build that section of the store out, so they call it 10 improvements. And so through productization, we were able to come in, at a lower cost in some ways, but at $260K, we could build out an entire section of Walmart for that $260K, but it would take 8 days with a crew of 8. And these are not your typical laborers. These are, respectful to them, but unskilled laborers, because it's basically building a digital system. They're just locking together cam locks with an Allen wrench. And so one of those projects we ended up being reused. So they basically said 2 years later, hey, we need to actually take this section of the store out again. And so we basically deconstructed it, sent it back to the factory, reconfigured it for a similar sized project with the optometry vision center, redeployed it, and based on ownership of those assets, we went from $260K for the first project to $45K for the second project. So, that's just unheard of, in terms of savings, but I think products allow for those types of things to happen in terms of how they're using those ecosystems.
Alex, I'm going to ask if you have any follow-up.
The productization you're talking about is great. And it kind of ties into the standardization that we mentioned earlier, is when it is plug and play and easy to pick up, where in the case of the unskilled labor, you might have 5 minutes to learn how to turn the cam lock, but once you learn it, you're just doing the same motion hundreds of times. That's part of that standardization, part of the process of increasing efficiencies. And I'm not sure if is it a product thing, is it a process thing, is it a standardization thing? It's easy to say product because a lot of products do that, but I think it's more than just that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Productization within AEC is, for me, is another kind of like head scratcher of a topic, because everything that we build with is effectively already a standard commodity product. Nobody's sitting down designing, figuring out what framing sizes are going to be. You have standards to pick from, and that's all based on code requirements, fire ratings, all these different kinds of stuff. So wall assemblies are all the same, all sheet goods, all standard sizes. And so somehow we take, we've got a full Lego kit of parts, and we have since at least the 1920s. But we've decided to take Legos, and instead of just putting them together the way Legos go together, because all mechanical fasteners, all the end connectors of mechanical fasteners are standardized so that you can use tools to interface with them. So the whole tool industry is built around the same ecosystem. All the parts and pieces are there, and yet instead of putting the Legos together, we seem to cut little parts off of them, and then we glue them together, and we kind of smash them together in kind of weird ways, and paint over them, and throw half of it in the garbage, and then say, we need a Lego kit of parts, that's what's going to fix everything. So what I'm really curious about from a productization standpoint is okay, fully commodity, and they're commodities too, so it's you're using wood framing, light gauge framing, again, generally, it doesn't matter where you're buying from. So, at heart, all of this kind of stuff. And so, when we talk about, maybe more sophisticated productization of sub-assemblies and stuff like that, is the benefit there, these additional constraints that we're just out of tune with all the regular commodity products that we use and the way that we use them, that actually kind of creates enough interference that people recognize, I've got to just stick with these kind of sizes, these modules. Customization is one thing, variability is another. There was an architecture firm in the UK that went back and looked at all the different bathroom designs they did over some period of time, and they noticed that like they were all basically the same except they differed by a few centimeters each. And it was just, so they're each unique bespoke bathrooms that they can charge a premium for. But the insanity is they keep doing the same thing over and over again. And it was no real benefit to them. And the costs were really high because it's like, customization doesn't mean you get the same thing every time. It just means you work within fixed variables. And so, maybe that's where, more of the productization we're seeing right now is kind of pushing for that. And maybe it makes more of an investment, so it increases the asset value of these products for reuse in the future that maybe is trying to help people think a little bit differently or see it differently because, otherwise, again, it's just this really strange phenomenon that we have in our industry.
I want to add to that. It's, for me personally, clarify it's not an either or. It's not a product or service concept. It's these are not the accurate numbers, but let's say today it's 80% service based and then 20% product plug and play. Industrialized construction, in a perfect world, will flip that, where it's 80% product based plug and play, good to go, with that little bit of customization and field work and makeup on the pig is a term that people use sometimes. Though, in my opinion, there'll always be that little bit of field finishing, little bit of site work. But if you can take the general standardized stuff, either the easy to do on a mass scale production scale or complex and you want to do it right in a controlled setting, take those, bring that into the industrialized aspect, and then if it's installing a light fixture, do that in the field. You don't need to have a whole factory assembly line to install a light bulb. So I think that's about the balance of making sure that we're focusing on the right things in the industrialized capacity as opposed to all of it, and allowing for that customization or the illusion of choice, if you want to call it that. I call it that, where customers still get choice, but they're not choosing their framing, to your point. They're choosing the paint color. And those are all things that can and should be done in the field after everything else in the bones are in place.
Yeah, I agree. There's no silver bullet, right? I think it's those incremental changes in the field or in the industry that then create those efficiencies and help the industry move forward. Yeah.
Well, one of the things we talked about in relation to this, similar and very intentionally not diving into the AI conversation, but I will use AI as a metaphor again, is just the idea of modular isn't necessarily either or replacement. It is something that's a tool in a tool belt, as you said. So I'd love to know, again, thinking about that from the context of a traditional AEC firm, how can they incorporate industrialization or modular into their business model, or what needs to change to incorporate it into their business model?
Yeah, and full disclosure for us, I know there's incremental changes that AI can bring to what we're doing. I don't know what those fully look like yet. I feel like it's this journey of discovery and then slowly trying to figure out those pieces and how to implement them and how they play in our ecosystem. And I know it's a necessity. I just don't know about jumping into things too quickly in that category, which maybe it'll put us behind. I don't know, but I'm willing to take that chance.
And to be fair, speaking about AI as a metaphor here. So, changing business models again, the either/or conversation is there a way again to integrate modular industrialization into what would be considered a traditional business model?
Well, flagging from one of the speakers yesterday made a comment about AI. It's not AI is going to replace a particular thing. It's the designer who uses AI wisely is going to replace the architect who can. Same thing with modular, and I think all of us agree, is builders who utilize industrialized components or systems wisely will eventually outpace and succeed versus those who choose to not adopt. So AI industrialized can be seen as both tools rather than solutions.
Yeah, I don't think it's the specific delivery mechanism. I think it's certainty. It's just getting to better certainty, which leads to reliability. So there are ways to industrialize processes even in traditional design and construction that are just going to make businesses more profitable. They're going to have a steadier pipeline of projects. They're going to be able to do their scheduling better, which is, I think, can untangle a lot of the problems of, that we run into now, which drive a lot of the costs, which is a project goes on hold and now you have to demobilize and you got to remobilize somewhere else and you're trying to do this all on the fly. It creates a lot of problems. So I think industrialization is the most important part of IC. It is not the particular delivery mechanism. It's not full volumetric modular or panelized or whatever it may be. It is the process of trying to get to more certainty and reliability. And ultimately, I think that's what's going to help address a lot of these kind of systemic issues that we see in the industry. And something related that I wanted to bring up, because I always kind of find it fascinating, and I don't know the answer to this, but I think, again, it's just a really interesting question, is the graph that's always shown about the kind of flat or declining productivity in construction over the last 50 years. If you look a little bit to the left of that graph, and this is even cited, in the years before that, so leading up to up until the 1950s, early 60s, the construction industry was outpacing productivity across the entire market. And so there's a real inflection point in that graph. And what fascinates me is, why don't we talk about what the inflection point is? Why did that happen? What changed? Because I think that, again, is not any one thing. I totally agree there's no single silver bullet, but what if, if we start to look at what happened around that time period and what maybe changed, can we better understand how to ask the right questions? And some of the things that are related to that is, you think about what happened in the 1960s and 1970s. This was also the time when manufactured housing went from being, 1 in every 5 homes in the US to dramatically lower percentage, 3 to 5% now. You had the energy crisis, you had the creation of OSHA and additional health and safety requirements, all good things. You can also start to look at the average number of sheets in any construction project exploded over the last several decades. Now typical construction projects, those CD documents are hundreds if not thousands of pages. They used to be a lot fewer. There's a lot of interesting aspects to this that I think really will help focus in and say, okay, when we try to industrialize, what are some of the things? We have to jump through so many more hoops now. There's so much more regulation, so much more code, so much more localization of this stuff. Not that it's a bad thing or unwanted, but it does create a huge burden and a lot of extra work. And I do think, I know we were chatting about whether or not we should really get into AI or not, but that is one particular aspect that this technological shift could have a huge impact on. As we've often talked about right now, there's a lot of interpretation that goes into these things. There's way too much information and too many references that any individual can keep in their head all at the same time to even figure out, is this the right thing to build? Is it the right thing to design? Is it the right cost? Is it the right price? And having systems that actually can rapidly ingest and provide feedback across vast data sets to help you better understand, is this basically the right product market fit? That could be, have a very substantial impact.
Thanks. So just one more question, something we haven't really touched on is sort of the future needs of the workforce as it relates to industrialized construction. So, John, I think I'll kick this question to you. If you could detail what you see as sort of the future needs of the workforce and how we can go about meeting those needs.
Yeah, so a couple of things you see with the workforce is skilled labor, obviously, is diminishing. Just the pool of people that have the core knowledge, which you see the quality, I think, of some of the projects that are being built. So we really value those skilled laborers, obviously, and I think there's been some really great programs that are being created, especially at the high school level, vocational programs, to really try and improve the foundation of those laborers and the numbers. But I also see like another category that really I think it parallels industrialized construction a little more in terms of when we're looking at the labor, and that really is the creative category. So creatives are kind of one of the biggest exploding categories of laborers in the world, in the United States especially, which sometimes you affectionately refer to them as like YouTubers, maybe, it could be one category. But I think it's really empowering that category of creatives to be able to understand how to utilize these industrialized construction products And I think it's going to be a whole new class, in my opinion, in some ways, not 100%, but of creatives that are the ones that are going to be learning these products and being able to maybe even watch a YouTube video or use other resources to be able to start building.
Alex, I'll kick that same question to you.
Well, for SK, it's a dual pathway where, yes, it's all about education, and for the younger generations who are more open to new ideas, new concepts, absolutely. That through education, through classes, they'll lean more towards the industrialized aspect. For the traditional workforce, though, one thing James Hardy's doing is designing significantly different education platforms, not to train them up to be nuclear engineers, but to increase their efficiencies in the field, to increase productivity, basic business acumen, not to discourage the skilled or unskilled workforce, but to help maintain it, help it grow, help it thrive in a tight margin economy. And I think it's the responsibility, in my personal opinion, it's the responsibility of a lot of product manufacturers to provide that guidance and assistance to those who are using their products.
Joshua, last one for you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think, again, nothing new, but in terms of the workforce, it's figuring out how do we provide more at a higher quality and faster with a smaller workforce, because that's just where it's going. And having to do it in a way that doesn't rely on people developing decades of expert knowledge to do a specific thing, because I think in some respects it's already too late. The workforce that has that knowledge is going to age out faster than new workers can spend enough time with them to get that knowledge. So we've got to adapt what the workforce looks like.
Thank you. So I think I'll turn it to the audience now. I want to thank my panelists for answering my questions, but I think we have time for one or two questions from the audience. If we've got any sitting out there.
Hey, Judy Goodell, I'm still on the board with Debs. So, you were just talking about workforce development, and just today the government wants to shut down job corps and do all that again. So it's up to us as companies and suppliers and stuff like that that's where we need to go to find our labor and to be able to do that. It is out there. I also am very involved in Skills USA in different groups. It's there. The younger generation wants to be here with us and do all these new technicals and building and doing it right. But once again, it's up to us to be able to fight that down the street here so that they keep these programs alive and doing well. So that's my 2 cents when you want to talk about labor.
Yeah, Judy, I want to say too, good to see you.
Good to see you.
So I was a school counselor before I stepped into this crazy new role, but it drove me nuts because really at the school level too, there was this common communication that if you didn't go to college, you weren't going to be successful, right? And so I think we're coming out of that, but really what it did is it sent a bunch of kids to college that didn't finish, that I saw, and that walked away with a ton of debt, whereas they could have had a successful career in a vocational category, which now they say is the new class of millionaires, right? Plumbers, electricians. And so I think...
And Judy.
Yeah, and Judy. So I think it's just changing the narrative too, like on how we communicate with our youth and the values that we expose to them.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point as well. From the Autodesk perspective, a lot of what we're doing lately is supporting partnerships between some of our largest customers and where they're headquartered, their local community colleges. So to follow, kind of a similar method where it's not as much trying to kind of fight for, getting things reinstated as saying, okay, that's awful, but what can we do to still kind of help support and drive this? And so the community colleges, they are amazing in terms of basically saying, what is the workforce needs in our local area? We will develop the curricula for that. And we are trying to also step in and say, great, and we are going to help be a software provider so that, these kids can be taught all the skills that they need. They know how to use the technology. They basically have a direct path to employment because, these large GCs and others are there ready to hire them and wanting to hire them. And so that's, we're continuing to look, we have a whole education group that continues to look at how can we support that in different
I
locales.
totally agree with you when it comes to that stuff, but we also have to look at those other programs because we have a lot of programs that have to do with the military, incarceration, coming out of incarceration, and the different avenues, and not only our students at a younger age, and trying to get those through. But you're absolutely correct. But we can't have people take away programs. We need them to add to the programs, or if they don't like something that's in there, let's fix that program, or do whatever it is that we need to do to enhance these programs. And every manufacturer and every builder out there, let's look for that and let's help grow this. Otherwise, we're all going to be in a stalemate.
So, thank you, Judy.
Yeah.
I just want to say we are at time. So I want to give big thanks to my panelists for agreeing to sit down. Thank you for all of you for attending. So thank you. And I think next on our calendar is a brief break for lunch. I'm not sure. Anyways, thank you to each of you. Appreciate it.